The moment she stepped into the priority boarding line, Jessica Carter could feel the invisible walls tightening around her. Eyes glanced her way, not in welcome but in calculation. Judgments whispered behind pressed lips, not loud enough to be heard, but clear enough to be felt. She stood tall, phone in hand with a first-class boarding pass displayed boldly on the screen. Yet somehow that wasn't enough. Without a single word spoken from her, two uniformed security officers were already moving toward her, summoned like backup in a crime scene. No greeting, no verification, not even a glance at her boarding pass. Just four sharp words from the gate agent. "Ma'am, step aside." They weren't said with courtesy. They were delivered like a verdict. Jessica's heart didn't race, but her jaw tightened. Around her, a quiet approval lingered in the air. An approval born from people thinking someone had just been put back in their place. To them, she didn't look like a first-class passenger. Not with that skin, not with that simple ponytail, not with that calm, composed expression that didn't beg for permission, but exuded something deeper, something they couldn't understand, so they chose to reject it. As the two officers approached, she stood her ground, lifting her phone higher. The words, "Seat 1A," first class, glowed from the screen, undeniable and clear. But it made no difference. Kyle Thompson, the gate agent in the polished suit and pristine name tag, barely flicked his eyes at it. The smile he had just given the previous passenger had evaporated the moment Jessica stepped forward. "I'm sorry, ma'am," Kyle said coolly, his voice dipped in condescension. "This line is for first and business class only." Jessica's tone remained even. "I know," she replied, holding up the screen again. Kyle didn't even bother to scan it. Instead, he leaned to whisper to a nearby colleague, signaling with a subtle tilt of his chin. Within moments, the two officers were at Jessica's side. One of them, tall and stone-faced, stared down at her. "Step out of line. We need to verify something," he ordered. "Have I done something wrong?" she asked quietly, though she already sensed the answer. "Just follow instructions," the officer snapped. Passengers behind her began to murmur. Some looked annoyed by the delay. Others simply watched, intrigued. Jessica was pulled aside without further explanation. As she moved, she could feel their stares pressing into her back like knives. Kyle stood smugly near the desk, arms crossed, his job seemingly done. She took a slow breath, centering herself. She had expected something like this. But what they didn't know, what none of them could possibly guess, was that she wasn't just someone who bought a first-class ticket. She was someone who held the fate of the entire airline in her hands. She reminded herself silently, they have no idea who they're dealing with. Behind the composed silence in her eyes, Jessica was calculating, observing, deciding just how far they would take this. She was on a mission, a deeply strategic one assigned by the board of Genesis Financial Holdings. She had been sent not just to fly, but to observe, to evaluate. The airline was under final consideration for a $4 billion merger, and she was the final vote. As they scanned her ID and scrutinized her documents, Jessica stood quietly in a corner. The security check, completely unnecessary, was clearly about something else. The suspicion, the subtle disdain, the judgment in their eyes, all rooted in the same silent system she had seen far too often. Kyle Thompson, the man who initiated it all, was a polished product of that system. Fresh out of hospitality school, with a clean resume and expensive shoes, he prided himself on keeping standards high. Standards that, for him, had little to do with tickets and everything to do with appearances. He whispered to a colleague, loud enough for Jessica to hear. "Probably just another upgrade from loyalty points. Happens all the time with, these types." His colleague chuckled in quiet agreement. Jessica said nothing. She'd heard worse. She'd lived through worse. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that she had already decided to remain silent. Not because she was powerless, but because she wanted to see how far they'd push their assumptions. The security officer reluctantly scanned her code again. This time the system beeped confidently, flashing in bold letters, "First class, priority verified." He blinked unsure, glanced at Kyle. Kyle shrugged, irritated, and muttered, "Fine, let her in." Jessica returned to the line. No apology offered, none expected, but the air around her had changed. Her silence had grown heavier, no longer just composed but foreboding. She walked toward the jet bridge, passing passengers who still whispered with suspicion behind her back. Let them talk, she thought. They would know soon enough. Jessica Carter was no ordinary traveler. She was the one who could either sign or sink the most critical deal in the airline's history. And they had just awakened something they never should have poked. She slid into her seat. Seat 1A with grace, her gaze fixed on the runway beyond the window. The jet hummed in anticipation. The sky stretched endlessly ahead, and in the calm before takeoff, she allowed herself a single quiet thought. Now let's see how deep this really goes. If you've ever witnessed someone being judged just by their appearance, share the story. Let's challenge assumptions and hold the powerful accountable. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories that matter. From the moment Jessica fastened her seatbelt, she could feel the tension in the air, soft, invisible, but sharp as a blade. The hum of the cabin, the soft clinks of champagne glasses, the careful footsteps of attendants. It all played out like a carefully choreographed performance. But as she leaned back in her seat, her presence felt like a disruption to the rhythm. The head flight attendant, Olivia Sloan, was already making her rounds. Her posture was poised, her smile effortless, as she offered passengers warm towels and whispered greetings that oozed refinement. But the moment her eyes landed on Jessica, something shifted. The smile vanished, replaced not with hostility, but with something colder, an absence, as if Jessica's seat had suddenly become empty. Jessica noticed, of course. She noticed everything. Olivia walked right past her, skipping her row entirely, as if the person seated in 1A didn't exist. The man across the aisle received a perfectly folded towel with a touch of lavender. The woman behind Jessica was handed a glass of chilled wine, complete with a curated menu. Jessica sat quietly, untouched and unseen. She didn't raise her voice, didn't demand attention. She waited not out of patience but purpose. Every second of silence was Olivia's opportunity to reveal who she really was, not through grand actions, but through omission. Minutes passed, the silence deepened. When Olivia came back around, Jessica raised her hand gently. "Excuse me," she said, her voice calm and measured. "I haven't received a towel or a menu like the others." Olivia's eyes flickered. Surprise, then irritation, then a mechanical smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Oh, I thought you didn't need one. I'll get that for you in a moment." She turned swiftly, her heels clicking a little harder against the floor. Jessica didn't flinch. She wasn't expecting an apology. She wasn't expecting anything. This wasn't about towels or menus. This was about something else, something that ran beneath the surface of luxury. Olivia's actions weren't random. They were deliberate, and Jessica knew it. She had seen this before, not always in airplanes or luxury lounges, but in boardrooms. Negotiations, investor summits. It was the look of people who didn't recognize power unless it wore the right suit, the right skin, the right brand. On a handbag, Jessica had stripped all that away on purpose. Her jeans were faded, her hoodie plain. No designer logos, no flash. She hadn't come to impress anyone. She came to observe, and Olivia was giving her more than enough to record. When Olivia returned, she placed a towel in Jessica's lap with no words. It wasn't warm. It wasn't lavender scented. It was cold, damp, and limp, like an afterthought. The menu was dropped beside it. Still no words. Still no eye contact. Jessica looked at the towel, then slowly placed it aside. She didn't react, didn't sigh, didn't roll her eyes. That would have been too easy. She simply leaned back in her seat again, her hands folded gently in her lap. If Olivia thought this was about attitude, she was wrong. If she thought she was in control, she was even more mistaken. Jessica had made no demands, no accusations, no confrontations. She had given Olivia every chance to choose decency, and Olivia had failed. Across the aisle, the businessman who had been watching the exchange smirked slightly and turned away. Behind her, the quiet murmurs of judgment began again, low, careless vibrations in the air. But Jessica remained composed, unmoved by the ripple of doubt. She knew what was coming. The test had just begun. Outside, the sun hit the wing of the plane, casting a warm glow across the cabin. But inside, Jessica could feel the coldness settling deeper. Not in the temperature, but in the way some people chose to treat others when they thought no one important was watching. That was the mistake. Jessica wasn't just watching, she was deciding. And for Havenport Air, every look, every skipped towel, every whispered judgment, they were writing their own verdict. The plane had barely begun taxiing when Olivia returned with a tray of welcome drinks. Her expression was neutral, sculpted into the kind of smile that flight attendants were trained to wear. charming from afar. Hollow up close, Jessica watched her approach, not with anticipation, but with quiet clarity. She wasn't here to drink champagne. She was here to see how far this dance of pretense would go. Olivia served the couple in 1B and 1C first, her voice low and sweet as she offered them vintage sparkling wine and a warm, practiced laugh. Then she turned and passed Jessica again. No drink, no offer, no words. Jessica let the silence linger, let Olivia finish her round and vanish behind the curtain, separating the galley from the cabin. She could have called out. She could have pressed the attendant button, but she didn't. This wasn't about correcting a service error. It was about understanding the pattern, and the pattern was clear. A few minutes later, Olivia returned. This time her tray was empty, save for one glass. Jessica straightened slightly, assuming the final drink was for her. It wasn't. Olivia reached across to the man seated behind Jessica and handed it to him with a flourish before turning to make her way back. Jessica's voice was soft but clear. "Excuse me." Olivia paused, her back to her for a second too long, then turned slowly. "Yes," she replied, that smile returning, but only to her mouth. Never her eyes. Jessica tilted her head. "Is there a reason I haven't been offered anything to drink?" Olivia blinked once, then offered a tight shrug. "Oh, I thought you might prefer something after takeoff. We've had guests request that before." Jessica nodded slowly. "I see." She said nothing more. The exchange was brief, forgettable to anyone else, but not to Jessica, and not to Olivia either, who walked away with stiffer shoulders and a sudden restlessness in her steps. What Jessica had just delivered wasn't a complaint, it was a mirror, one that Olivia clearly didn't enjoy looking into. As the plane lifted off the ground, the hum of the engines filled the cabin, softening the world outside to a blur of clouds. Jessica kept her eyes forward, watching the sky rise beneath them. Her fingers remained still on the armrest, but her mind was racing. How many times had she seen this? Not just in planes, but in high-rise towers and tech mergers, in hotel lobbies and five-star restaurants. Environments where the illusion of equality was draped in luxury linens and polite phrases. But behind it all, the same rot lingered. She had expected scrutiny, even suspicion. But Olivia's behavior wasn't born from hesitation. It was choice, calculated omission. The kind of subtle prejudice that rarely made headlines, but shaped experiences every day. A voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking." Jessica barely heard the rest. Her focus was elsewhere now. A cart rolled by. Another flight attendant, young, nervous, less guarded, smiled genuinely as she offered snacks and drinks. Jessica accepted a sparkling water with a thank you. The girl blushed slightly and nodded. So it wasn't about airline policy. It wasn't about logistics. It wasn't about anything written down. It was about who was given dignity and who had to earn it. Jessica took a sip, letting the cool water settle her breathing. She could have pulled rank right then. She could have demanded names, filed a report, asked to speak to the captain. But she didn't. Not yet. Instead, she waited. The most dangerous person in the room isn't the one who shouts. It's the one who watches, and Jessica Carter was watching everything. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the cabin noise melt into a distant hum, her heartbeat steady, her memory recording. Because when the time came, she wouldn't need to raise her voice. She'd let the truth do it for her. The flight had reached cruising altitude. Passengers settled into their comfort, unfolding tablets, flipping through magazines, adjusting silk-lined blankets over designer shoes. But Jessica sat still, framed by the soft glow of the window, her eyes unfocused but wide open. That's when Olivia returned. Again, this time it wasn't just indifference, it was strategy. She stopped at the row ahead, her tone syrupy as she asked the older couple if they'd like a hot entree. The woman requested the herb-roasted chicken. Olivia nodded cheerfully, then turned toward Jessica's row. But instead of addressing her, she leaned toward the man and wondered, "Would you like the salmon or the steak, sir?" Jessica waited. Her turn never came. She raised a brow, observing Olivia retreat down the aisle with her tablet in hand, skipping Jessica completely. Not a question, not a glance, as if she were invisible. The same girl from earlier, the younger attendant, approached a few moments later with a puzzled expression. "Excuse me, ma'am, have you placed your meal selection?" Jessica shook her head gently. "No one asked. No one." The attendant blinked, confused. "I'll check for you right away." She disappeared behind the curtain, and Jessica could hear faint murmurs. Olivia's voice sharp and clipped, followed by a hasty shuffle of paper. Then came the explanation. Olivia returned a tablet in hand, face neutral. "I'm terribly sorry," she said, her tone clipped at the edges. "It appears there was a system error. Your meal selection didn't process. Unfortunately, we've just run out of the steak and the chicken. All that's left is the vegetarian wrap." Jessica's lips curved ever so slightly. Not in amusement, in acknowledgement. "I'll take the wrap," she said simply. It wasn't about food, it never had been. Later, as the tray was delivered, lukewarm and missing utensils, Jessica ate in silence. She could feel Olivia watching from a distance, waiting for a reaction. But there was none. The quiet acceptance was far more unnerving than protest. A new announcement crackled over the intercom. "We've encountered a bit of unexpected headwind," the captain said. "So to ensure proper weight distribution, we'll be asking one passenger from the first-class cabin to move to the rear. Thank you for your understanding." It was odd. Jessica had flown enough to know that unless it was a near-empty aircraft or a weather emergency, such moves weren't standard, especially not for passengers in paid first class. Still, she waited. Sure enough, moments later, Olivia returned with a tight expression and a forced smile. "I'm afraid we'll need you to move to the economy cabin for the remainder of the flight," she said. "It's strictly a safety measure, nothing personal." Jessica looked up, eyes steady. Was anyone else asked to move? "No," Olivia said too quickly. "But this row is the best choice logistically." Jessica didn't move. "You've chosen a single passenger in first class. Coincidentally, the only black woman in this section to relocate due to weight distribution." Olivia's smile faltered. "Please don't make this into something it's not," Jessica paused. She could have raised her voice, she could have demanded a supervisor, but instead she simply said, "I will not be moving." The air around them thickened. Passengers turned to look, but Jessica remained calm, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The businessman in one seat shifted uncomfortably. A few rows back, whispers started again. "I'm in my assigned seat," she continued, "and unless the captain himself comes to request otherwise, I'll remain here." For a second, Olivia didn't know what to do. Her training hadn't prepared her for someone who refused politely, firmly, and with full knowledge of her rights. She turned without another word and disappeared again behind the curtain. Jessica exhaled slowly, but her posture remained composed. She had just drawn a line in the sky, one not easily erased. This wasn't about creating conflict. This was about exposure, the kind that couldn't be explained away with technicalities or training manuals. Because sometimes the most powerful resistance comes not from confrontation, but from stillness. Jessica didn't need to prove she belonged in seat 1A. The real question was, how long would it take for them to realize it? The cabin had gone quiet again. The kind of silence that isn't peace but waiting. Jessica had returned to her book. Her legs crossed her mind, somewhere far from the petty power plays swirling around her. But the storm was only gathering strength. It arrived in the form of a man named Robert Davis. He was seated one row behind diagonally across mid-60s. Expensive suit, gold cufflinks, his shoes polished like mirrors, his confidence even shinier. From the moment he boarded, Robert had behaved as if the entire cabin had been designed for his comfort, and everyone else was just lucky to be allowed in. Jessica had noticed his glances since takeoff, the way he kept looking her way, frowning as if her presence disrupted some unspoken agreement. Now, as the meal trays were cleared and the wine cart made its way down the aisle, Robert leaned forward. "You know," he said, his voice loud enough for several rows to hear, "first class used to mean something." Jessica didn't look at him. Robert continued, undeterred. "Nowadays, it's just points and diversity hires." A few passengers stiffened. Someone coughed. Jessica calmly turned a page in her book. Robert wasn't done, not saying it's your fault. Airlines are just lowering standards for appearances. You get what I'm saying, right? She finally looked up, not at him, through him. "Do you often speak to strangers this way?" she asked quietly. He chuckled as if they were sharing some kind of joke. "Relax, sweetheart. I'm just making conversation. No need to get emotional." Jessica's eyes didn't blink. That word emotional is often used when men feel threatened by a woman's silence. Robert shifted in his seat, caught off guard. "I'm not threatened. I just find it interesting, is all. People like you sitting in seat 1A, it's surprising." Jessica tilted her head slightly. "And what exactly do you mean by people like me?" He hesitated, but only briefly. Come on, let's not pretend you know. The silence that followed was suffocating. The younger attendant stood frozen near the galley, unsure whether to intervene. Olivia, meanwhile, was nowhere to be seen. Other passengers began stealing glances, hoping someone else would say something, do something, anything to end the discomfort. But Jessica stayed perfectly still. Then, with calm precision, she closed her book, placed it on the tray table, and turned fully toward Robert. Let me help you clarify what you're struggling to say, she said, voice low but clear. You saw me, made an assumption based on skin posture, clothing. You decided I didn't belong, and now you're uncomfortable that I do. Robert opened his mouth to speak, but she continued. The irony is, while you've been busy calculating my worth from a distance, you haven't once considered that I may be the only person on this plane who has the authority to decide if it even keeps flying. The weight of those words didn't come from volume, but from truth. Robert's face twisted. That's ridiculous. Jessica leaned in just slightly. Is it? Then she sat back again, calm, collected, the way only someone certain of their power can be. Robert didn't reply. Instead, he reached for the button above his seat and summoned a flight attendant. And right on cue, Olivia reappeared, drawn not by duty but by disruption. Yes, Mr. Davis, she asked sweetly. I'm feeling uncomfortable, he said, pointing toward Jessica. She's being aggressive. Jessica didn't even flinch. Olivia turned to Jessica with a rehearsed expression. Ma'am, is there a problem? Jessica spoke before Olivia could say more. Would you like to explain exactly how I've been aggressive? There was no answer. Jessica looked from Olivia to Robert, then added, You've skipped my service, offered me the worst of everything, asked me to move seats, and now allowed a fellow passenger to insult me openly. A pause then. But sure, let's talk about who's being aggressive. For the first time, Olivia had no script. She shifted uncomfortably, muttering, I'll speak to the captain if needed. You do that, Jessica replied. And while you're at it, feel free to let corporate know they've officially crossed the wrong line. The businessman across the aisle, who had remained silent through most of the flight, gave a small nod of acknowledgement, barely perceptible, but enough to be noticed. Jessica turned back toward her window, the conversation over before anyone else dared to speak. Outside, the sky was beginning to soften into twilight. Clouds stretched like silk across the horizon, peaceful and untouched. Inside, the silence was different now. It wasn't the quiet of waiting. It was the quiet before consequences. The twilight outside bathed the cabin in a golden hue, as if trying to soften the jagged tension that had taken root in the air. Yet Jessica didn't need softening. She needed only truth, and in that moment, her truth was louder than anyone else's voice. Olivia hovered awkwardly near the galley curtain, uncertain whether to retreat or reassert her authority. But Jessica had already taken control without raising her voice, without lifting a finger, and everyone on board could feel it. She sat perfectly still, her face unreadable, posture poised not in defensiveness, but in quiet dominance. It was the kind of stillness that unsettled people used to commanding spaces. A silence filled not with fear, but with power. Robert Davis had sunk back in his seat, his bravado quickly deflated. His hands fidgeted with the edge of his cashmere blanket. His eyes no longer met hers. Olivia finally broke the stance, still approaching slowly with forced professionalism. I've spoken with the captain, she said, tone clipped. He's asked that all passengers remain calm for the duration of the flight. Jessica met her gaze with a stillness that felt like gravity. I've been calm, she said. You, on the other hand, may want to reflect on whether calmness and compliance are the same thing. Olivia's jaw tensed, but she didn't reply. Jessica continued, her voice even. When you're in a position of service, your job is not to measure who is worthy. It's to serve all with dignity. And when you fail at that, not just once, but repeatedly, it becomes a pattern. A pause, and patterns have consequences. Olivia opened her mouth, perhaps to protest, perhaps to apologize. But Jessica's calm left no space for excuses, only accountability. There's nothing else to discuss, Jessica added softly. She turned her eyes back toward the window, as if dismissing the entire exchange with a glance. The quiet that followed was thick with something new. Respect, or perhaps fear, disguised as it. The younger attendant, the one who had brought Jessica water earlier, approached timidly a few moments later. She set down a fresh drink, a neatly folded towel, and a note tucked beneath the edge of the napkin. Jessica unfolded it quietly. It read, "I'm sorry for what you've experienced. Some of us see it, I see it." Jessica folded the note again, slid it into the pocket of her jacket, and nodded subtly toward the girl, who walked away with gratitude etched in her eyes. Small acts, but they mattered. Jessica didn't need an audience. She didn't need apologies broadcast through the cabin. Her dignity hadn't been lost. It had simply been tested. And with every slight, every assumption, every condescending word they threw at her, she hadn't fallen apart. She had only grown more certain. That certainty now filled the space around her. A quiet authority that no badge, no uniform, no boarding pass could assign. As the plane began to dip into its descent, the clouds parting below like waves drawn back to shore, Jessica closed her eyes briefly. She thought of the meeting waiting for her. The boardroom full of executives who had no idea what had unfolded in the sky above them. The billions hanging in the balance. The future of this airline perched on the signature of a woman they had almost thrown into coach. She opened her eyes again. No, she wasn't angry, not visibly, not loudly, but the flight wasn't over, and neither was her decision. The seatbelt sign blinked off with a soft chime, and a chorus of rustling filled the cabin, passengers gathering coats, switching phones back on, brushing away the fatigue of flight with a sense of routine. But for Jessica, the descent was not just toward the tarmac. It was into something deeper, something colder. She remained seated as others stood watching, and Olivia scurried up the aisle with the urgency of someone desperate to exit a situation she could no longer control. The cabin door hissed open. The bridge connected. The lights above flickered as the plane powered down, and then Jessica saw them. 2 uniformed security personnel stood just outside the exit. Not airport staff, not customer service, but armed security. The younger flight attendant, the one who had slipped her the note, froze mid-step, her eyes darting from the officers to Jessica with a flicker of alarm. Olivia, standing by the cockpit door, offered no glance toward Jessica, but her posture betrayed everything. Rigid spine, forced smile, hands clenched tightly behind her back. As the first-class passengers exited, Jessica stayed where she was, calm as ever. She knew she had felt this coming, not because of anything she had done, but because of everything she represented. One of the officers finally stepped onto the aircraft, his voice low but firm. "Miss Carter, we'd like a word. Please come with us." Jessica didn't move right away. Instead, she turned her head slowly, eyes meeting the officers with a look that was not defiance, but disappointment. "Is there a reason I'm being escorted?" she asked evenly. "Just a quick inquiry, ma'am," he replied. "We were told there was a disturbance on board." "A disturbance?" she repeated, as if testing the weight of the word. She stood, adjusted her blazer, and took her time retrieving her bag. Every motion deliberate, calm. The entire cabin had gone still behind her. Even the flight crew at the back paused their duties, watching through the narrow space between seats. As Jessica stepped into the jet bridge, flanked by security, the atmosphere changed. The cheerful murmur of disembarking passengers faded, replaced by stiff glances and awkward silences. One couple stepped aside hurriedly, unsure of what they were witnessing, but certain it must be serious. That's how effective assumption is. Jessica walked ahead of the officers, now unbothered. She wasn't in their custody. She was simply letting them walk beside her. They led her to a private room near the gate, inside a plain table. 2 chairs, a security supervisor stood waiting, clipboard in hand, trying to look authoritative. He didn't quite succeed. "Please have a seat," he offered. Jessica remained standing. "Before we begin, I'd like to know who filed the report." The supervisor cleared his throat. "We received a call from the flight crew regarding an aggressive confrontation in first class. Did the report include the names of any other parties involved?" She asked. "No, ma'am. Just that your behavior was concerning." Jessica smiled, not out of amusement, but precision. She pulled a leather folder from her bag and placed it on the table. Inside was a single document with a silver embossed seal, the Genesis Financial Holdings Executive Clearance Badge. Below it, her name, her title, and her designation, Chief Strategy Officer Lead of International Acquisitions. The man's breath caught before he could speak. Jessica spoke instead. "You have just detained a sitting executive whose company is in final negotiations to invest $4 billion onto the airline you're protecting." Silence. "I was not aggressive," she continued. "I was silent, and apparently that silence offended the wrong people." The supervisor's eyes scanned the document again, slower this time, as if trying to make the words change, but they didn't. Jessica leaned slightly closer. I suggest you find out exactly who authorized this detainment, because tomorrow morning they'll be explaining it to a room full of shareholders. The officer beside her looked away, his face paling slightly. Jessica stepped back, folded the folder again, and turned toward the door. I'll be leaving now, she said simply, and she did. Each step down the corridor was steady, composed. Every turn of her heel echoed louder than any accusation made against her. She didn't need to scream. She didn't need to threaten. She just needed to be seen fully, finally, without filter. And now that the reckoning had only just begun. By the time Jessica stepped into the luxury SUV, waiting outside Terminal C, her expression hadn't changed, but the world around her was already starting to shift. Her assistant Marcus was in the front seat, phone pressed to his ear. The moment she entered, he handed her a second device, already unlocked and vibrating with messages. They called the board, he said, voice low but sharp. You've got their full attention. Now, Jessica gave a single nod, then dialed. On the third ring, the CEO of Genesis Financial Holdings picked up Jessica. He began, voice tight with urgency. We just received word from Havenport Heirs Legal. What happened? They escalated, she replied. Security detainment, public embarrassment, all without cause. A pause, then a sigh. And here I thought the in-flight champagne would be the riskiest part of this deal. Jessica didn't smile. They failed the test, every level from gate to cabin to post-flight. She heard papers rustling on the other end. Do you want us to pull the offer? No, she said. Not yet. There was silence. I want them to feel it first, she added. Let them scramble. Let them wonder. I'll be in the boardroom by 9 a.m. They'll know exactly who I am on my terms. She ended the call and leaned back in the seat, the city lights flickering across the windshield as they drove toward the hotel. Meanwhile, across town, panic was beginning to bloom. At Havenport Air's corporate headquarters, an emergency meeting was already underway. The CEO, Charles Redmond, stared at the screen in front of him, reviewing the incident report that had just landed on his desk. A woman was removed from the boarding line, targeted by a gate agent, dismissed by the flight crew, escorted by security, labeled a threat without cause, then the final detail. Passenger's name, Jessica Carter. Charles's stomach dropped. He turned to his chief legal officer. Please tell me, this is a mistake. It's not, Charles stood, voice rising. We just handed $1 billion gatekeeping experience to the one person who controls the fate of this entire merger. The room went silent. Someone fumbled with a remote, pulling up the flight's internal camera footage. It wasn't complete privacy. Laws prevented cabin audio, but it was enough. The skipped service, the ignored gestures, the confrontation with Davis, the cold towel, the body language of an entire crew too proud to question their own assumptions. Charles turned to the head of HR. Find me every single person who touched this. I want names, I want roles, I want statements. His voice grew colder, and pray she hasn't already signed the withdrawal order back in the SUV. Jessica sat quietly as her assistant scrolled through emails. Media's already sniffing, he said. We've gotten 2 interview requests from networks. They don't have the full story yet, but they know something happened. Jessica shook her head. We don't go public. Not yet. Let them spin. Let them stew. She looked out the window, watching the city blur into glass and shadow. This isn't about revenge, she added softly. It's about recognition. And then almost to herself, it's about time they learned who they've been serving in silence. At 8:57 the next morning, Jessica stepped out of the elevator onto the top floor of Genesis Tower, heels clicking against marble like a metronome of precision. The executive board was already seated. The mood was solemn. The screen displayed the Havenport logo temporarily frozen in limbo. She placed her folder on the table. I've reviewed the experience, she said. They listened. She detailed each moment, not emotionally but methodically. The denial, the dismissal, the assumption, the failure, and then the final line. Genesis Holdings does not invest in brands that operate on outdated standards of humanity. No one argued. No one could. Jessica closed the folder. I'm recommending a full withdrawal. Effective immediately, and with that, a $4 billion deal evaporated. Not with a scandal, not with a press release, but with the calm, deliberate voice of the woman they had underestimated from the moment she walked to gate A17. At precisely 10:15 a.m., Charles Redmond stood at the head of Havenport Air's executive war room. Tall glass walls, imported wood table, and the kind of skyline view meant to impress investors. But today, no one was impressed. The board sat in tense silence as the fallout took shape. Phones vibrated, laptops refreshed. Updates arrived every few minutes, each one sharper than the last. Jessica Carter's recommendation to pull the Genesis deal had already rippled through the financial press. Headlines were circling like vultures. $4 billion merger in jeopardy after discrimination. Incident, Charles removed his glasses and rubbed his temples. We have to move fast. If this becomes public, we don't just lose the deal. We lose credibility. The room remained still. Everyone knew the truth. It already was public. He turned to Monica Patel, VP of Human Resources. What do we know about the staff involved? Monica cleared her throat. We've identified 4 primary individuals: gate agent Kyle Thompson, lead flight attendant Olivia Sloan, flight crew member Natalie Rhodes, and a passenger, Robert Davis. Charles narrowed his eyes. The passenger, Monica nodded. Jessica was subjected to verbal harassment mid-flight. The crew failed to intervene. In fact, Olivia appeared to support the passenger's comments. Charles sat back in his chair, eyes drifting toward the glass. We trained them better than this, a junior exec, new still clinging to optimism, spoke up. Maybe we could offer a formal apology, reinstate the deal, at least reopen talks. The room turned toward him with a silence more condemning than words. Charles shook his head. She doesn't want an apology. She wants accountability. She already gave us a chance to do right, quietly. We failed, Monica interjected. There's more. Jessica Carter didn't just fly with us. She was conducting a covert service audit on behalf of Genesis Holdings. We were being evaluated at every step from check-in to touchdown. Charles leaned forward, and we gave her a masterclass in how not to treat a customer. The legal counsel pulled up surveillance clips on the main screen, compiled footage from the gate security cams and internal cabin monitors. Kyle's dismissive body language, Olivia's narrowed eyes and forced smiles, the blank stares from crew members who chose silence over standing up. It played without sound, but the message rang loud. Every action, or inaction, had been recorded in plain view. What about the younger attendant, Charles asked. The one who offered her water and slipped hers that note. Monica checked her tablet. Grace Lynn Jr. hire, only 6 weeks on the job. She followed protocol and showed empathy. Charles nodded slowly. Promote her. A few people blinked in surprise. She's the only one who acted with instinctive integrity. That's the kind of leadership we claim to value. So let's prove it. He stood and walked toward the wall where the Havenport mission statement was engraved in metal, elevating humanity one journey at a time. The words felt laughable now. He turned back to the group. Call Olivia. Bring in Kyle. Put Natalie on hold. I want full internal reviews launched today. I want every crew member from that flight rebriefed, retrained, or removed. No second chances. A heavy silence followed. Not of resistance, but of realization. This wasn't a PR crisis. This was a reckoning, and Jessica Carter hadn't needed a headline, a protest, or a press conference to bring it about. She had used the simplest weapon of all, truth delivered in silence, then written in consequence. Charles looked back at the screen, now paused on Jessica, standing calmly in the aisle, eyes forward unshaken. He whispered under his breath, not to anyone in particular. We judged the passenger and forgot who was actually flying this plane. Kyle Thompson was the first to enter the internal hearing room. Still dressed in his corporate attire, polished shoes tapping against the tile, he carried himself with the confidence of someone who hadn't quite realized the ground beneath him had already shifted. But when he stepped inside and saw the full disciplinary committee seated with Charles Redmond, himself at the head, his stride faltered. He sat down slowly, cleared his throat. Is this about the incident from yesterday? Charles didn't respond immediately. Instead, he clicked the remote and let the footage play clear. Undeniable, Kyle ignoring the boarding pass ice, calling security, dismissing a verified first-class passenger without even scanning her ticket. When the video ended, Charles finally spoke. You failed to verify, you failed to de-escalate, and worst of all, you acted with bias, not procedure. Kyle leaned forward, hands clasped. I was just following standard protocols. No, Charles said coldly. You were following assumptions. The termination letter was already printed. It slid across the table with finality. Kyle didn't argue, not because he agreed, but because he knew no defense would hold. The next to enter was Olivia Sloan. Her uniform still perfect, her hair still pristine. But the confidence that once wrapped around her like armor had begun to fray. She sat down, back straight, chin slightly lifted, as if clinging to the last threads of control. Charles didn't show the footage. This time, he didn't need to. Instead, he placed 2 items on the table, a printed passenger complaint, and a copy of the internal crew report signed by 2 witnesses. Multiple counts of unequal service. Charles said, negligence, escalation of conflict, and failure to uphold both protocol and decency. Olivia inhaled slowly. I was trying to maintain order. You maintained it for everyone but her. I didn't mean. He cut her off. Intentions don't matter when the impact is this clear. Her punishment wasn't termination, but it cut just as deep. Effective immediately, Olivia Sloan was removed from all international and first-class rotations, her supervisory status revoked, reassigned to domestic economy flights under direct oversight, her lips parted, then closed. No rebuttal, no apology, just silence. By the afternoon, crew member Natalie Rhodes had also been removed from flight status, pending retraining and a full evaluation. But perhaps the biggest shift came not from punishment, but from what followed. Grace Lynn, the junior attendant whose handwritten note had reached Jessica, was called into Charles's office personally. She arrived hesitant, unsure whether her actions had overstepped, but instead of criticism, she was met with something rare: acknowledgement. You did what every employee should have done, Charles said. You saw a person, not a profile, and you acted with compassion, not hesitation. He extended a letter across the desk: promotion to lead, attendant in training. Grace blinked, stunned. I thought I'd be written up for breaking rank. Charles smiled faintly. You didn't break rank, you broke silence. There's a difference. As the internal shakeup rippled through the company, so did a sense of reckoning. Emails were sent. Town hall scheduled. Senior management ordered a full audit of service protocols and bias training. But the truth was, no policy could fix what had rotted beneath their branding for years. Jessica Carter had never raised her voice. She had never issued a press statement, but her silence had unearthed the rot they refused to name, and now one by one they had to face it in an industry built on polished posture and perception. Havenport Air had been cracked wide open, not by a lawsuit, not by a protest, but by the calm, steady defiance of one woman who never stopped belonging, no matter how many times they tried to push her out. A week later, in the polished echo of Terminal D, Jessica Carter walked through the departure lounge, not as a passenger, not as a test, but as herself. She wasn't dressed for camouflage this time. Her black suit was tailored to precision. Her heels struck the floor with measured elegance. A leather briefcase hung at her side, not heavy with documents, but with presence. She had no need to hide anymore, not from judgment, not from misperception. She moved with the quiet force of someone who had already spoken the loudest truth and let it echo through institutions. At Gate 42, her flight hadn't begun boarding yet. She stood by the window watching jets taxi across sunlit runways, their shadows sweeping across tarmac like silent witnesses to the unseen. That's when she heard the voice, faint, familiar, Miss Carter. She turned slowly. It was Olivia, stripped of her crisp navy jacket. Her posture was different now, no longer tall with practiced polish, but careful, as if each step forward cost her a fraction of pride. She wore a domestic crew uniform, her name tag smaller, her eyes no longer defensive but exposed. Jessica said nothing. She didn't need to. I wasn't expecting to see you here. Olivia began, folding her hand. I heard what happened after you left. Jessica waited. I just wanted to say, I didn't realize who you were, Olivia admitted. Jessica's eyes didn't flinch. That was never the problem. Olivia swallowed hard. I wasn't trying to be cruel. No, Jessica replied. You were trying to be in control. You thought your title gave you permission to measure someone's worth at a glance. I was wrong, Olivia whispered. Jessica studied her, not with malice, not with superiority, but with the gaze of someone who had carried far more weight than Olivia would ever know. You thought I didn't belong, Jessica said, her tone steady. But the truth is, I wasn't there to prove I did. A pause. I was there to decide whether you did. Olivia's face paled. The weight of those words hung in the air, more final than any punishment, more lasting than any write-up. Jessica stepped closer, not to intimidate, but to offer clarity. Olivia had never been brave enough to face on her own. You spent the whole flight managing my presence, Jessica said, and never once paused to manage your prejudice. Olivia blinked, her throat tightening. She looked down, but Jessica continued. I didn't retaliate. I didn't embarrass you. I let your actions speak for themselves, I know. Olivia whispered, barely audible. That's what made it worse. Silence again. For a moment, the bustling airport around them seemed to mute itself, just two women standing in the aftermath of power misused and dignity reclaimed. Jessica stepped past her, but paused just beside her shoulder. Her voice was lower now, almost a whisper. You don't owe me an apology. She turned slightly. You owe it to the next person who looks like me and walks on that plane. Then she walked away. Olivia remained frozen, staring after her. Not in anger, not in humiliation, but in something heavier, understanding the flight departed on time. Jessica sat by the window again. Seat 1A, as always, the same seat, the same sky, but nothing felt the same anymore. Across the aisle, passengers settled in with casual ease, unaware of the history folded into that row. Unaware that a quiet war had once been waged here, not with shouts or fists, but with withheld towels, misted menus, and the icy indifference of assumption. Jessica didn't need to reflect on the specifics anymore. She didn't need to relive every slight or revisit every insult. What mattered wasn't the confrontation. It was the correction. She sipped water calmly as the new crew glided down the aisle, smiling attentive, equal in their gaze. The service didn't feel performative. It felt aware, not because of a new policy, but because somewhere someone had been forced to look at themselves. Some truths don't need to be shouted to echo. Jessica glanced out the window again. The clouds parted like a soft curtain, revealing the endless stretch of sky. Below it, the world carried on, busy, distracted, often blind. But change doesn't come in blinding flashes. It comes in stillness. It comes when someone refuses to shrink. When someone occupies space with grace and does not apologize for the room it takes. She thought of Olivia not with vengeance, but with clarity. The lesson had never been about punishment. It was about reflection. And that reflection now lived in Olivia's posture, in her lowered voice, in the flicker of something deeper than fear. Growth. Not every scar leaves a mark on the skin. Some reshape the system that caused them. Jessica leaned her head against the headrest and closed her eyes. Her body finally allowed itself to rest, not because the fight was over, but because the message had landed and it would fly further than any aircraft could take it. Some passengers fly for luxury, others fly for status. But she had flown for truth, and somewhere at 30,000 feet, truth had finally found its altitude.